David Miller sat alone on the weathered wooden porch of his small house, perched on the edge of McCauley, Idaho. The town stretched behind him in a patchwork of dusty roads and scattered homes, but David rarely ventured beyond his property. He had returned from the war years ago, leaving behind a life of chaos and command to settle into a solitary routine. Each morning, he would rise with the first light, brew a cup of black coffee, and take his seat on the porch, watching the sun creep over the horizon. The days blended into one another in a slow, predictable rhythm. David spent hours with old, dog-eared books in his hands, the pages worn thin by his rough, calloused fingers. The stories reminded him of his youth, of battles fought and friends lost, yet he never spoke of those days to anyone. His neighbors knew him only as the quiet old man at the edge of town, a man who kept to himself and preferred it that way. Despite his self-imposed isolation, David was not entirely alone. A lone wolf, lean and gray, had taken to appearing at the edge of his property. The first time David saw the animal, it had been a bitterly cold winter morning. The wolf stood motionless, its amber eyes fixed on David as he sipped his coffee. For several minutes, they stared at one another without moving. Then the wolf turned and slipped back into the woods, its paw prints disappearing in the snow. Over the months that followed, the wolf returned sporadically. David began leaving scraps of food on the far end of the porch, never approaching the animal directly. The wolf, whom he started to call Williams, would slink out of the woods, sniff cautiously at the offering, and eat while David watched in silence. Gradually, an unspoken bond formed between them, a fragile connection that neither sought to deepen nor break. Williams became the only living creature David shared his days with. When the wolf appeared, David would speak softly, recounting memories of his army days, the brothers in arms he had lost, the friends who never made it back. The wolf listened with unblinking eyes, its ears twitching at the sound of David's gravelly voice. Sometimes Williams would lie down, resting his head on his paws as though settling in for a long story. In these moments, David felt less alone. The wolf became his silent confidant, a wild, untamed listener to the secrets he dared not share with anyone else. Yet even in these quiet exchanges, David remained cautious. He knew that Williams was still a wild animal, bound to the forest, a creature that could never truly be tamed or trusted. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that they understood each other in a way that no human ever could. In the days that followed, whispers of wolf sightings grew louder in the town of McCauley. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about missing livestock and prowling shadows seen at dusk. Tension simmered, and a group of local men, armed and restless, began patrolling the outskirts with rifles slung over their shoulders. David watched them from his porch, his jaw clenched. He knew the fear was unfounded, driven more by rumor than reality. He tried to dissuade them, telling them the wolves were only passing through, but his words fell on deaf ears. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David sat in his usual spot, a book resting on his lap. A sudden crash echoed from the direction of his barn. He stood, heart pounding, and grabbed a flashlight. The barn door creaked as he pushed it open, the beam of light sweeping across stacked crates and old tools. And then he saw it. In the far corner, slumped against the wall, lay Williams. Blood smeared the dirt floor beneath him, his side rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths. David's pulse quickened as he stepped closer. The wolf's fur was matted with blood, and a fresh bullet wound marred his hind leg. The sight of the injury made David's stomach twist. He crouched down, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The wolf's eyes met his, a silent plea of pain and fear. Without a word, David set to work. He fetched his medical supplies, the same ones he hadn't touched since his army days, and returned to the barn. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and sweat as he cleaned the wound and removed the bullet, each movement precise and steady. Williams whimpered but didn't fight. Day after day, David nursed the wolf back to health, feeding him scraps of meat and speaking in a low, soothing tone. Despite the pain, Williams remained calm, his gaze following David's every move. Outside, the patrols continued, the sound of gunshots echoing through the woods at night. But inside the barn, a fragile bond grew stronger. As the days passed, Williams regained his strength. His eyes grew brighter, and he began to limp around the barn, testing his healing leg. And with every passing hour, David felt the walls of his own solitude begin to crumble, piece by piece. Weeks passed since David nursed Williams back to health, and the wolf gradually regained his strength. Each night, Williams would disappear into the forest only to return by dawn, resting near the old man's porch. David grew accustomed to the soft rustle of paws outside his door, the gentle eyes watching him from the shadows. The two shared a silent understanding, a bond forged in blood and trust. But the peace did not last. One foggy morning, David noticed a group of men gathered in town, their voices raised in heated conversation. News of livestock going missing spread like wildfire, and the blame fell squarely on the wolves. Armed with rifles and traps, the men planned a hunt to eliminate the perceived threat. David's heart tightened. Williams was still too weak to fend for himself, and with the hunters scouring the woods, it was only a matter of time before they found him. That evening, David sat on his porch, his mind racing. Memories of the war flooded back, the helplessness of watching his comrades suffer, the guilt of those he couldn't save. He couldn't let Williams become another casualty. He grabbed his coat and flashlight and headed toward the woods, the chill of the night air biting through his worn-out jacket. David moved silently, following the faint trail Williams often took. His eyes strained in the dark, scanning for any sign of the wolf. Hours passed, and the forest seemed unnervingly quiet. Then he heard it, a distant howl, weak and pained. His pulse quickened. He sprinted toward the sound, stumbling over roots and branches. There, in a small clearing, he found Williams trapped in a snare. The wolf's leg bled, and his eyes flickered with fear and exhaustion. Kneeling beside him, David's hands shook as he tried to free the snare. The metal was cold and unyielding, biting into his skin. Williams whimpered, and David whispered soothing words, his heart pounding. With a final, desperate pull, the snare snapped open. The wolf slumped against him, too weak to move. David wrapped his coat around the animal and hoisted him onto his back, his legs trembling under the weight. As David trudged back toward the house, he could hear distant gunshots echoing through the forest. The hunters were closer than he thought. Fear gnawed at him, but he pressed on, refusing to let go of the only friend he had left. Inside the small, dimly lit church, mourners gathered in solemn silence. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of lilies and the low murmur of hushed voices. The coffin rested at the front, a simple wooden casket adorned with a single bouquet of white roses. The preacher spoke in a somber tone, recounting the life of David Miller, the reclusive veteran whose quiet presence had been a fixture in the town for decades. As the congregation listened, a sudden gasp echoed through the room. From the open church doors, a dark shape bolted inside, moving swiftly through the aisles. It was a wolf, lean, wild, and unmistakably familiar. The animal's eyes were fixed on the coffin, a burning intensity in its gaze. Before anyone could react, the wolf lunged forward, sinking its jaws into David's throat. Screams erupted as people scrambled to their feet. Some rushed to the exit, others stood frozen in shock. A few men shouted for someone to call the authorities, but no one dared to approach the wolf. For a tense, terrifying moment, the wolf held its grip, its teeth buried in the dead man's neck. Blood did not flow. David was already cold. Then, as suddenly as it had attacked, the wolf released its hold. The animal stepped back, its chest heaving, its eyes locked onto David's lifeless face. There was no rage in its gaze, only a profound, haunting sorrow. It lingered for a heartbeat longer, then turned and bolted back through the open doors, disappearing into the woods. Inside the church, the stunned mourners remained in stunned silence. Whispers spread like wildfire, questions hanging in the air without answers. What had just happened? Why had the wolf come? And why had it attacked the man it had once called friend? In the morgue, during the final examination, one of the doctors noticed a faint pulse on David's wrist. Shock rippled through the room as David's eyelids fluttered and he drew in a shallow, raspy breath. The attending physician immediately called for assistance, his voice trembling with disbelief. David had been declared dead hours ago, but now he was clinging to life. Further examination revealed that he had suffered a severe anaphylactic shock triggered by an allergic reaction. The reaction had constricted his airway, rendering him unconscious and nearly lifeless. The wolf's bite, as bizarre as it seemed, had punctured the swollen tissue in David's throat, allowing a passage for air. The puncture, though minor, became the crucial factor in his survival. Nurses and doctors surrounded him, murmuring in as David's chest rose and fell with each labored breath. The hum of medical equipment filled the room, a rhythmic reminder of his fragile grasp on life. News of David's miraculous revival quickly spread throughout the hospital. His family rushed in, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and overwhelming relief. Tears streamed down his daughter's face as she clutched his hand, feeling the warmth she thought was lost forever. His son stood motionless, unable to process the sight of his father, who had been so close to death, now lying before him, breathing. But as David regained his senses, his gaze roamed the room, searching for someone. Not his family, not the doctors, but the wolf. The memories flooded back, the sound of the wolf's growl, the pressure of its jaws against his neck, the piercing eyes that looked at him with a strange, urgent understanding. David tried to speak, his voice a hoarse whisper, but the words wouldn't come. Yet, in his mind, a single thought echoed. It was not death that came for him in the church that day. It was his old friend, the wolf, who had saved him one last time. Weeks passed, and David slowly regained his strength. The days blurred into one another, each one marked by the same quiet routine. The slow shuffle of his feet, the muted creak of the wooden porch, the empty rocking chair swaying gently in the wind. Each evening, he sat on the porch, eyes fixed on the edge of the forest, waiting for a shadow to emerge from the dark. He strained to hear a familiar rustle, a low growl, a sign that his old friend had returned. But the nights remained still. The forest kept its secrets, and the silence hung heavy around him. David's daughter visited often, urging him to move closer to the city to be with family. But David refused. The forest was his home, the porch his perch, and the wolf, though absent, was still a part of him. One night, the air was thick with mist, and the moon cast a silver glow over the treetops. David sat as usual, his frail hands clutching the arms of the rocking chair. Then, through the haze, he saw it. A dark, familiar silhouette standing at the edge of the forest. It was Williams. The wolf stood still, his eyes locked onto David, his form half hidden in shadow. David rose slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, and took a step forward. The wolf did not move. David approached, and as he drew closer, Williams lowered his head, allowing David to place a trembling hand against his fur. The old man knelt, his forehead resting against the wolf's neck. Time seemed to stand still as they remained that way, man and beast, bound by a silent understanding. When David finally pulled back, the wolf looked at him one last time before turning away, disappearing into the depths of the forest without a sound. David watched until the darkness swallowed Williams whole. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying away the last echoes of a farewell. David returned to his porch and sat down, feeling the emptiness settle around him. The wolf was gone, but the bond remained, a memory etched deep in his heart. A debt repaid, a life saved, a friend forever lost to the wild.